He had the land, the king's favor, and the gold to pay for her execution. But he forgot one thing. The countess was listening. Cordelia found the name of the man who forged the treasonous seal. Now she just needed to get the physical evidence to the one person powerful enough to save her life before the king's guards silenced her forever. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. The crown sought her death and her land. She had no allies, only her defiance. But the queen, a woman of lethal calculation, granted her one chance. Prove your innocence in 7 days or the axe falls. The air in the Grand Council chamber did not move. It was trapped and thick, scented with old incense and the cold, metallic fear of the Countess Cordelia Hayes. Outside, the capital city churned with the dull, ignorant noise of commerce. But here, beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Judgment Hall, a terrible, profound stillness reigned. It was an opulence designed to crush the will of any who stood accused, a silence amplified by marble columns that soared toward gilded cherubs, witnesses to law, but rarely to justice. Cordelia, 22 years old, was the solitary point of life in this frozen tableau. She was seated centrally, not in a chair of honor, but on a low, ornate stool that forced her to look up at the dais where the power of the kingdom sat enthroned. Her gown of rich sapphire velvet felt like lead. It was the formal wear of her station, now an ironic shroud. She pressed her fingertips into the polished wood of the armrest, silently counting the lines in the grain, a desperate, childish effort to anchor herself against the suffocating authority of the room. Her face, framed by long, wavy hair, was marked by youth and emotional turmoil, tears threatening, but her posture held a brittle, fragile defiance. Her eyes, however, were not fixed on the imposing figure of the king, but on the woman seated slightly to his side. Cordelia Hayes carried the weight of her family's legacy, the 300 square miles of fertile, strategically vital land bordering the restless north. She carried the weight of the name her father had given her, the one she would drag into infamy if the proceedings went as planned. Most pressingly, she carried the raw, heart-stopping terror of the axe. They want the land. They do not care about the truth. This cold clarity was the only weapon she possessed. A fleeting memory, sharp and painful as glass, pierced her composure. Her father, years ago, tracing the boundary lines on a map in the library, his hand calloused from the reins, his voice booming with the pride of generations. Our legacy, Cordelia, a responsibility, not a luxury. That memory was the reason she hadn't dissolved into hysterics. Her grief at his loss had been profound, raw, but the accusation of treason, the political fabrication woven to strip her of that very legacy, had forced her terror to crystallize into a fierce, white-hot refusal to surrender. She was politically naive, too trusting in the sanctity of law, and that naivete had been the flaw that allowed the net to be cast. But now, fear had given way to an immovable resolve. King Alastair Penn, the ultimate embodiment of that crushing authority, stood before her. He was 60, imposing, and clad in a richly colored, ermine-trimmed mantle that looked heavier than armor. His gray beard added a false air of patriarchal wisdom to a face etched with grim determination. He was the accuser, the lord, and, for all intents and purposes, the executioner. His hand, heavy and ringed, pointed an accusatory finger, not at a document, but directly at Cordelia. His expression was severe, confirming his certainty of her guilt, or more likely, his ruthless conviction in the outcome he desired. He was an authoritarian presence, controlling the conversation with the sheer weight of his avarice and his crown. The treason was a lie. The land was the truth. Beside him, watching the drama unfold with an unnerving stillness, sat Queen Genevieve Shaw. The queen was 48, wore a smaller, more elegant crown, and was dressed in deep violet silk, symbolizing restrained, yet absolute, power. Her hands were composed in her lap, her face a measured mask of seriousness. She was the political realist, the one who understood that the king's desire for the land was both blatant and dangerous. She knew that Cordelia's death would settle the ownership dispute, but a patently false accusation of treason, settled too quickly, could shatter public faith in the throne. She was Cordelia's only faint hope. The queen met Cordelia's gaze, not with sympathy, but with a keen, assessing scrutiny. It was a look that weighed the countess's spirit, her youth, and the plausibility of the king's hurried demands. A figure of quiet, intellectual intensity stood just behind the queen. Jeremiah Stone, the royal advisor. He was a man of middling age, dressed in practical, elegant court attire, his keen eyes observing every micro-expression on the king's face. He had quietly provided the queen with the legal and political repercussions of a swift, unsubstantiated execution, subtly ensuring that the court maintained an appearance of legitimacy. Cordelia did not know it, but he was already her unwitting, essential advocate. The king's deep, authoritative voice cut through the silence like a dropped gauntlet. The Countess Cordelia Hayes, by the evidence before us, a document bearing her seal and signature, intercepted during transport, did conspire with enemies of the crown to cede strategic Western territories. I find her guilty of high treason. I demand immediate forfeiture of her properties, including the Ravenshaw holdings, and the swift administration of justice. The word justice was a hammer blow. Cordelia's breath hitched, the room tilting slightly. This was it, the precipice. But just as King Alastair began to rise, preparing to pronounce the final, fatal word, Queen Genevieve's voice, calm and clear, sliced through the mounting tension. It was not loud, but it possessed an authority that momentarily checked the king's momentum. My lord, the charge is capital. The document is damning, yet the accused stands defiant. To execute a noblewoman of the countess's standing, upon the sole evidence of an intercepted letter, invites skepticism among the houses. A hasty verdict is politically unwise. King Alastair froze, his jaw tightening. The queen looked at Cordelia again, the measure in her eyes now a quiet challenge. The crown seeks swift resolution, but not at the expense of its own honor. Countess Hayes, she addressed Cordelia directly, her voice cutting through the space between them. I grant you a reprieve. You claim innocence against the king's evidence. You shall have 7 days, not a moment more. The silence that followed was broken only by the queen's next, final command. Royal advisor Jeremiah Stone shall oversee a covert investigation. He will have full access to the evidence and the countess. In 7 days you shall return, and if no conclusive counter-evidence is presented, the king's verdict will be affirmed, and the sentence carried out immediately. The reprieve was a terrifying gift. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, a temporary, impossible stay of execution. Cordelia's political fate had shifted from a certainty to a terrifying race against the clock. Her immediate emotional response was a gasp of relief, quickly followed by the bone-deep realization. She had to prove the king was lying, or she would die. 2 guards moved forward instantly, but Cordelia was already rising, her sapphire gown rustling faintly. She did not look at the king. Her last, desperate connection was with the queen. Cordelia managed a single, profound nod, a promise of action, before she was escorted from the chamber. As the massive, bronze-bound doors were pulled shut behind her, the sound was not of dismissal, but of a vault ceiling. Cordelia was no longer a victim on trial. She was a combatant, a runner in a desperate race. The world outside, the palace corridors, now felt like a labyrinth of deadly political currents. She was in prison, but she was alive, and the game had just begun. The invisible hands that had tried to drag her back toward the past were now the hands of the clock, pushing her toward the future or the grave. Her only allies were the quiet, loyal maid who might hold an overlooked detail, and the severe, skeptical advisor appointed by the queen. 7 days. 7 days to fight the most powerful man in the kingdom for her life and her legacy. The silence left in the wake of the judgment was not empty, but heavy with unspent political rage and the cold certainty of death. The bronze-bound doors had sealed Cordelia Hayes into a new reality, one defined by the ticking down of 7 short days. She did not weep, not yet. Tears were a luxury she could not afford, a weakness that would satisfy King Alastair and confirm the court's cruel assumptions about her fragility. As the 2 royal guards escorted her through the palace's hushed corridors, Cordelia kept her chin lifted, her sapphire velvet gown moving with an artificial stiffness that belied the frantic terror clawing at her insides. Every footstep on the polished marble floor was a clock stroke. Every corner they turned a shortening of her lifespan. The king's determination had been a visceral, terrifying thing. He hadn't merely accused her. He had consumed her with his gaze, his pointing hand, and the sheer, unbridled arrogance of his power. He needed her land, the strategically vital Ravenshaw holdings that anchored the kingdom's northern defenses, and to get it, he required her ruin. The treasonous document was merely a tool, a sharp, legalistic blade to separate her neck from her shoulders and her land from her family. Cordelia felt a strange, detached appreciation for the sheer audacity of the plot. The king, the supposed defender of the realm, was the true thief. He had manufactured the crime, controlled the evidence, and intended to execute the victim. It was a perfect piece of political villainy, and it was only the Queen's intervention that had paused the swift, fatal conclusion. Queen Genevieve. Cordelia replayed the moment in her mind, seizing on the details like a starving woman grasping at bread. The Queen hadn't shown kindness. Kindness was weakness, and Queen Genevieve was a woman carved from ice and political calculation. No, the Queen had intervened because a quick, unsubstantiated execution would have been politically unwise, creating ripples of instability among the major houses who valued legal propriety. Genevieve Shaw was playing a longer, more dangerous game than her husband. She cared not for Cordelia's innocence, but for the stability of the crown, and the king's transparency had threatened that stability. The 7-day reprieve was not a mercy. It was an ultimatum framed by high politics. It was the Queen saying, "The king has made his move too hastily. If you can provide me with a credible alternative truth, a truth I can sell to the public and the nobility, I will use it to check my husband's power. If you fail, you are politically disposable, and your death is a necessary consequence of cleaning up his mess." The realization was grim but empowering. Cordelia was not fighting for sentimental justice. She was fighting for the Queen's political convenience, that she understood, that she could work with. Sentiments die easily. Self-interest is eternal. The guards led her not to the dungeons, but to a discreet set of apartments in the older, quiet wing of the palace. The room was not unpleasant. It was furnished with heavy velvet drapes and a 4-poster bed, but the windows were bolted, and a pair of king's men were immediately posted outside the door. She was under house arrest, a gilded cage designed to preserve the appearance of dignity while ensuring she had no contact with the outside world. They hadn't put her in the dungeon, she realized, because they needed her alive and present for the final, public show. As the heavy door closed with a muffled thud, Cordelia walked to the small writing desk, steadying her hands on the cold wood. She needed to access the strength her father had always attributed to the Ravenshaw women. Fierce clarity in the face of impossible odds. The guards had left her alone, save for one companion, Rosemary Finch, her loyal maid, who had been waiting anxiously in the anteroom. Rosemary was younger than Cordelia, her face etched with fear, yet her loyalty was a fierce, unwavering thing. She was dressed simply, looking out of place amidst the heavy palace luxury. She rushed forward, forgetting protocol, and clutched Cordelia's hands. "My lady! Thank God! Thank the Queen!" They said the king demanded immediate. Rosemary's voice broke into a choked whisper. "Hush, Rosemary. I'm here. For now." Cordelia held her maid's hands tightly, drawing strength from the girl's genuine terror on her behalf. They have granted a reprieve. 7 days. We must use every second. The king's charge is a lie. He wants the land, nothing more. And we must prove how the lie was constructed. She stepped back, her composure hardening. Rosemary, seeing the cold, analytical glint return to her mistress's eyes, instantly calmed, falling back into her role. How may I serve, my lady? I will do anything. We begin with what they think is their perfect crime, Cordelia stated, moving to the window and testing the bolts. They were secure. They claim a letter, sealed with my signet, was intercepted. A letter detailing the cession of northern territories to a foreign power. That is patently false. I have written no such letter. Therefore, someone forged it, and someone delivered it to the king's men to be intercepted. Cordelia turned, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Rosemary, the king's court is a viper's nest. But the king himself does not dirty his hands with forgery. He has powerful collaborators, men who stood to gain from the lands and who have the access and skill to create the false seal. We are looking for an intermediary, someone close to the king or one of his ambitious ministers, who arranged the forgery. Rosemary, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, visibly struggled to organize her fear into facts. But, my lady, the accusation, it was presented just after the Northern Defense Bill passed. The one that made the Ravenshaw holdings essential to the crown. Exactly, Cordelia confirmed. The motive is the bill. The treason is the pretext. The door creaked open, interrupting their conversation. It was Jeremiah Stone, the royal advisor. He did not ask permission to enter, simply stepped inside, followed by another guard who remained posted just inside the room, ensuring the conversation was confined to the authorized ears. Jeremiah Stone was exactly as he had appeared on the dais. Intellectually intense, dressed impeccably, and completely impassive. He carried a leather-bound folio under his arm. Countess Hayes, he greeted her, his tone purely professional, devoid of warmth or condemnation. I am here to begin the investigation as per Her Majesty's decree. I will be thorough, and I will be impartial. You understand that your life now depends entirely on the veracity and strength of the evidence you can provide. I understand, Advisor Stone, Cordelia replied, meeting his gaze steadily. And I welcome your impartiality. It is a commodity in short supply here. Stone ignored the subtle barb. He placed the folio on the desk, opening it to reveal crisp official documents. I have been permitted to bring the evidence presented by the king. The intercepted document. Cordelia felt her heart give a sickening lurch, but she forced herself to approach. He slid the document across the desk. It was a thick, aged piece of parchment, bearing the recognizable script of a court copyist, and indeed, sealed with the Hayes family crest. Is this your writing, Countess? Stone asked, his tone crisp. No. It is a skilled forgery. The king himself knows my penmanship. This is the hand of a professional scribe, Cordelia said, her voice steady. She pointed to the seal. The seal is correct, but there are certain defects in the wax, small hairline fractures I recognize from an old signet ring my father used to use. A ring I have not possessed since his death. The king, however, would not know that specific detail. Stone made a quick note on his pad, but his expression remained skeptical. Forgery is an easy defense, Countess. Who is this professional scribe? And who commanded them? That is what I intend to find out, Cordelia countered. My defense is not merely that I didn't write it, but that I have no logical reason to have written it. My family's loyalty is centuries deep. My fate is intertwined with the stability of the realm. Ceding our lands to a foreign power would destroy my lineage and our name. It makes no sense. Political motivations rarely adhere to perfect logic, Countess, Stone observed coolly. Greed, debt, coercion. The possibilities are endless. You must provide a counter-narrative that is stronger than the king's accusation. He looked pointedly at Rosemary. You have a maid here. She would be an obvious conduit for information or perhaps for the forged document itself. Where was the maid on the night of the 11th, when this letter was allegedly dispatched? Rosemary flinched, her eyes wide with fear, and Cordelia stepped slightly forward, placing her hand on the maid's arm, a protective gesture. Rosemary is fiercely loyal advisor. She was with me almost every moment in the fortnight surrounding the alleged dispatch. But she has one key memory that may be relevant, one that has nothing to do with me. Cordelia turned to Rosemary, offering a gentle but firm cue. The messenger, Rosemary. The one you saw leaving the king's chambers in the early hours. Rosemary, finding strength in Cordelia's touch, took a shaky breath. Yes, sir. It was late. Or early, rather. The morning of the 10th. Not the 11th. I was fetching hot water for my lady. I saw the king's private messenger, Master Thorne, the nervous little man, leaving the king's wing, but he was not dressed in his usual court livery. He was wearing a dark, heavy cloak, and he wasn't carrying the usual king's satchel. What was he carrying? Cordelia prompted gently. Rosemary frowned, concentrating fiercely. A small wooden box, not a scroll case, and he was nervous, very jumpy. He left through the servants' staircase, not the main hall. It was odd. Jeremiah Stone stopped writing. His eyes narrowed, reflecting a flicker of genuine interest for the first time. The king's personal messenger would not use the servants' stairs unless he was carrying something unauthorized, something illicit, or something he wished to keep entirely secret from the public eye. Cordelia pressed the advantage. If this forged document was intercepted on the 11th, why would the king's own courier, the day before, be carrying a secretive item in a wooden box, leaving the palace covertly? It suggests a clandestine meeting advisor, a meeting to pay a skilled craftsman, perhaps, or to receive a package that contained a new, recently forged seal, or the final forged document itself. Stone leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. A courier carrying a payoff or new tools for the forgery, the day before the alleged treasonous act was set in motion. That is an interesting thread, Countess. It suggests premeditation and involvement from within the king's inner circle. He looked at the window, then back at Cordelia. This is the nature of our arrangement, Countess. I will use the resources of my office to discreetly pursue this Master Thorne and the trail of the wooden box. You, however, will remain here guarded. You have given me a lead. Now you must trust one am capable of following it. Cordelia watched him, realizing the immense risk the advisor was taking. By pursuing this line of inquiry, he was potentially crossing King Alistair. His impartiality was less about justice and more about protecting the Queen's political reputation, which meant he would not tolerate the King's amateurish plotting. I have no choice but to trust you, advisor, Cordelia admitted, a stark honesty in her voice. My life is tethered to your success. But know this, I may be confined, but I will not be silent. I will spend every hour reviewing the court registries, the financial records, and the recent land transfers that have passed through your office. The king wants my land. Who else in this court stands to benefit from its forced sale or forfeiture? Who is positioned to act as the king's hidden broker? Stone nodded slowly, a thin, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. A worthy pursuit, Countess. Use your confinement to study the true heart of this conspiracy. The money trail. I shall return within 3 days. Until then, you are not to communicate with anyone outside these rooms, except for necessary sustenance. Your maid, Rosemary, is your sole contact to the outside world, and her movements will be monitored. Be discreet. Be methodical. With that, Jeremiah Stone gathered his folio and departed, leaving Cordelia and Rosemary alone once more in the plush, silent prison. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence felt heavier than ever, but now it was charged with purpose. Cordelia turned to Rosemary, her expression shifting from defiant nobility to intense focus. He is our ally, but he is a slow-moving target. We have 7 days, Rosemary. We have to work faster than the king expects. We must find a way to verify that messenger's destination. He didn't carry that box to a seamstress. He carried it to the man who would forge the final piece of my ruin. Now, tell me everything you know about the guards, the servants on this floor, and how one might acquire a copy of the recent royal ordinances without alerting the guards. The race had begun, not with a dramatic chase, but with the quiet, desperate scratching of a quill and the relentless scrutiny of a young woman fighting for her life against the ruthless ambition of a king. The next 3 days would be spent entirely within the confines of her gilded cage, poring over the documents Stone had left, archaic legal texts and dull council meeting minutes, searching for the hidden financial link, the single courtier whose ambition matched the king's greed, who had the money to pay a master forger, and the access to deliver the final forged letter into the trap. The clock was running. 7 days, and the world outside was waiting for the fall of the axe. Cordelia Hayes had a lifeline, but she had to swim toward it with every ounce of wit and courage she possessed. She knew that the political chessboard was set, and the pieces were being moved. The king had moved his pawns toward her throat. The queen had moved the advisor, Jeremiah Stone, to check the king's arrogance. Now Cordelia, the threatened queen on the board, had to move herself, using Rosemary as her eyes and ears in the shadow court of the servants, to find the true, hidden enemy before the 7th day broke. The door, though heavy and richly paneled, offered no real barrier to the king's authority, only the illusion of privacy. As soon as the sound of Jeremiah Stone's retreating footsteps faded down the corridor, Cordelia Hayes moved instantly, not to the chair, but to the door itself. She pressed her ear to the wood, listening for the muffled exchanges of the 2 guards posted outside, gauging their cadence and their attention level. They were new men, unfamiliar with the palace's routines, and their conversation was already drifting toward the predictable. Duty hours, the weather, and the sheer audacity of the Countess's treason. They thought her guilt was a foregone conclusion, a political inevitability. Their laziness was her first, small victory. She turned back to Rosemary, the subtle shift in her demeanor transforming her from the accused noblewoman into a focused conspirator. They are new, they are bored, and they expect me to weep, not to scheme. We must use their certainty against them. Rosemary Finch, her face still pale but resolute, nodded. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had been channeled into a fierce, practical loyalty. She knew the palace better than the new guards. She knew the shadows, the rhythms, and the weaknesses of the staff. She was the loyal shadow Cordelia needed. My lady, I can manage the flow of food and water. The kitchen staff on this wing is mostly older. They do not talk. I can perhaps... Rosemary began, but Cordelia cut her off with a precise gesture. We start where the advisor started. The courier, Master Thorne, and the wooden box. The king's plot rests on the forged document, which means the conspiracy's weakest point is the moment of its creation or delivery. You saw Thorne leaving through the servants' stairs with a clandestine package on the morning of the 10th. That is our fragile thread. We must turn that memory into a chain. Cordelia leaned closer, her voice barely a breath. Rosemary, think. The servants' staircase leads down to the lower courtyard and the kitchens, but it also provides discreet access to the warren of small apartments beneath the east wing. These apartments are often used by low-ranking clerks, former scribes, or artisans hired for quick, anonymous projects. Thorne, carrying something he wished to conceal, was going there, or meeting someone there. Rosemary's eyes widened as the realization struck. Yes, my lady. The apartments. They are mostly dark during the day, but that morning, the one I saw him. There was a smell, a peculiar smell, clinging to the air around the staircase entrance. A smell? What kind of smell? Cordelia urged, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Rosemary closed her eyes, dredging the memory from the depths of her fear. Not food, not coal smoke. It was sharp, like chemicals, like oil but stronger, and metal, like a locksmith's shop, but mixed with something else, like a peculiar kind of melted wax. Cordelia felt a rush of adrenaline, a mental breakthrough. Wax, not just ordinary sealing wax, but the kind used for precision work. The wax used to cast a delicate object, like a die for a signet ring, or perhaps the solvents used in the preparation of a counterfeit seal.
A forgeres den.
The pieces were beginning to align with terrifying clarity. The king, needing a perfect forgery, had hired a skilled artisan, a scribe or a goldsmith who specialized in seals, and had used his personal courier, Master Thorne, to manage the illegal transaction. Thorne, paranoid and avoiding the main thoroughfares, was the messenger of ruin. "Rosemary," Cordelia whispered, her eyes shining with fierce focus, "you must go down to the kitchens. Not for water, but for information. But not about me, not about Thorne. You must inquire about the residents of the East Wing's lower apartments. Which one of them is new? Which one keeps odd hours? Which one has a peculiar, chemical smell about his door?" Rosemary hesitated, her lips trembling. "But my lady, the guards are watching, and if anyone suspects I am looking into the king's people—" "You are not looking into the king's people, Rosemary," Cordelia corrected, her voice firm. "You are looking into the smell. You are a maid who is worried about a strange odor that might attract rats, or be a fire hazard. Use the language of the servants' hall, not the court. Speak to the most senior cook, the one who complains the loudest. Frame it as a domestic concern. Your loyalty to me demands this risk, Rosemary. This is the only way we find the king's collaborator before Stone returns." Rosemary took a deep breath, the sheer gravity of the request settling over her. She knew the consequences of discovery would be dire, but the thought of Cordelia facing the axe was a terror far greater than any physical risk. "I will go, my lady, but I will need a distraction for the guards. Even a momentary one." Cordelia smiled, a cold, calculated twist of her lips. "The guards are expecting a tearful, demanding countess. I shall give them one. I will require a specific bottle of wine for my dinner, the one my father favored. It is stored deep in the western cellar. It will take them time to fetch it, and the request, though simple, will show them I am merely dwelling on my grief, not on my escape." The subtle deception worked. Cordelia called loudly for the guard, lamenting her ruined life and demanding a bottle of the 45 Bordeaux from the king's private collection. The request was eccentric, the kind of emotional indulgence expected of a young woman facing death. One guard grumbled about the trouble but dutifully set off, leaving the second guard alone and complacent. Rosemary slipped out moments later, dressed in a muted gray dress, blending perfectly into the palace's service landscape. Her task was terrifyingly simple: find the source of the smell. Cordelia, alone, now turned to the legal documents Jeremiah Stone had left. While Rosemary was the foot on the ground, Cordelia was the brain, the one who needed to find the king's partner in the court. The treasonous letter was evidence of what happened. The financial records would reveal who benefited. She spread out the council minutes and the land registry documents, her eyes scanning for anomalies. She ignored the obvious names, the king's immediate supporters. She was looking for a minor lord, a courtier with ambition, who had recently paid off massive debt, or, critically, one who had recently been granted a significant, but non-Ravenshaw, piece of land nearby. "Alistair wants my land, but he cannot annex it all himself without a paper trail. He needs a proxy, a powerful courtier who will absorb the land, pay the king a finder's fee under the table, and then wait for the scandal to subside before officially taking possession." She traced the recent transfers. Lord Harrington received a minor title, but nothing of value. The Duke of Alnwick, too rich, too powerful to risk the king's shady dealings. And then she found it. A recent, substantial acquisition by the Comte de Valois, a man known for his rapacious greed and crippling gambling debts. The Comte had, 6 months prior, acquired a massive, non-contiguous piece of territory bordering the Ravenshaw lands to the south. A piece of land which, while not as vital as the northern border, suddenly made the Ravenshaw property essential to connect his own disparate holdings. More significantly, the acquisition had been paid for in full and in gold, a transaction that had baffled the exchequer, given the Comte's notorious financial state. The Comte de Valois. Cordelia wrote the name down on a scrap of paper, her quill scratching fiercely. He was the perfect, desperate collaborator. He was ambitious enough to participate in treason, wealthy enough to pay off a master forger, and financially ruined enough to desperately need the king's secret favor. He would absorb the Ravenshaw lands, essentially consolidating his power in the region, and secretly give the king the money he needed. Hours passed in the tense silence of the room. Cordelia devoured the pages, building a circumstantial case against the Comte de Valois, the massive, inexplicable influx of gold, the strategic land purchase, his sudden, loud support of the king's aggressive border policies. Just as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the carpet, Rosemary returned. She looked exhausted and terrified, but there was a spark of success in her eyes. She quickly locked the door behind her and rushed to Cordelia's side, whispering rapidly, "I found it, my lady." The old cook, Dame Ilaria, was complaining about the new tenant in apartment 14A in the old wing, a man named Master Eldrin. She says he keeps to himself, pays his rent directly to the king's steward, and that his rooms smell terribly of burned chemicals and metal dust. The smell is so bad, the maids refuse to clean that entire section of the corridor. Dame Ilaria believes he is an alchemist. Cordelia felt a surge of triumph so powerful it almost stole her breath. Eldrin, a scribe or artisan hiding in the old apartments, smelling of metal and chemicals. Rosemary, that is the forger. That is where Master Thorne carried the box. Cordelia pointed to the name on her scrap of paper. Now listen carefully. The collaborator is not Eldrin. He is the tool. The man who ordered this treason is the Comte de Valois. He is the one who recently acquired the South Territory with gold and who stands to profit the most. But how do we prove it, my lady? Rosemary pleaded. The Comte is powerful. He is shielded by the king. Cordelia picked up the forged document, holding it up to the waning light. The forger, Eldrin, may have been paid, but he is also disposable. If he created the perfect seal, he would have had to keep samples, perhaps even the original die, until the final payment was made. If we can get a message to Jeremiah Stone, directing him not to chase the king's messenger, but to investigate the Comte de Valois' finances and, critically, to discreetly search Master Eldrin's apartment for the original forging die, we may have a chance. The fragile thread was now a visible line, leading from Rosemary's memory, through the forger Eldrin, and up to the collaborator, the Comte de Valois. Cordelia only had 3 days before Stone returned. She needed to move faster than the speed of the court. She needed a way to communicate this vital, damning information without alerting the guard standing 10 feet away, a guard who knew that any communication with the outside world would mean Cordelia's immediate demise. The weight of the world, and the finality of the king's demand, settled once more upon her shoulders, but now it was accompanied by the electrifying burden of purpose. She was no longer just the accused. She was the investigator, and the walls of her prison were about to become the headquarters of her defense. The subsequent 48 hours within the confines of Cordelia's gilded prison were a grueling, silent war of nerves. Rosemary, using the pretext of demanding specific, complex linens for Cordelia's comfort, managed 2 more discreet trips, confirming that the noxious, chemical smell in the East Wing apartments persisted. She reported that Master Eldrin, the suspected forger, kept his doors and windows tightly shuttered, rarely emerged, and only accepted delivery of food and supplies under a heavy shroud of secrecy. The forger was a rat in a hole, and the Comte de Valois was the hand dangling the cheese. Cordelia, meanwhile, consumed the court documents, her fingers stained with the old ink of ledgers and ordinances, confirming every financial anomaly related to the Comte. She found the paper trail of the king's greed, but she still lacked the physical proof, the smoking gun, that would convince the pragmatist Jeremiah Stone. On the third day, Stone returned. He entered the room with the same measured professionalism, devoid of any emotional register, making him an unnerving presence. He dismissed the guard, retaining only his personal, silent attendant, and set his folio on the desk. "Countess Hayes," he stated, his voice flat, "my inquiry into the king's courier, Master Thorne, has yielded only dead ends. Thorne is a ghost. He took 2 days of sudden, unexplained leave and returned with a perfect, plausible alibi concerning a sick relative in the countryside. He claims he was nowhere near the East Wing, nor was he carrying any illicit packages. The trail is cold, and the time we have is short." Cordelia met his gaze, refusing to betray the surge of disappointment. She had anticipated the king would cover his tracks. The king is not a fool, advisor. He would never allow his personal courier to be the weak link. The alibi is manufactured, perfect, and utterly worthless. We must move past the king's messenger and focus on the king's motive. She pushed the stacks of legal papers across the desk, her movements precise and deliberate. "You asked me to provide a counter-narrative stronger than the king's treason. I give you the financial truth, advisor Stone. Forget the forged letter. It is merely a sharp weapon. Look at who held the hilt and who was paid to sharpen the blade." Cordelia tapped a finger on the bold, almost arrogant entry in the council minutes. Exhibit A. The Comte de Valois, a man buried under 2 lifetimes of debt, whose gambling habits were legendary. 6 months ago, he acquired the sprawling Montclair lands to the south of Ravenshaw. He paid in full, in gold, baffling the exchequer. Where did that wealth come from, advisor? Not from his own coffers. She moved her finger to the second page, a land transfer map. Exhibit B. The Montclair lands are useless, swamp and scrub, but combined with my Ravenshaw holdings, they form a massive, contiguous estate that controls the entire southern approach to the king's new garrison. The Comte de Valois is the king's proxy. The Comte pays the king a secret, massive sum for the Ravenshaw land, clearing his own debt and consolidating a powerful domain. The king gets the money he needs for his war chest without the parliamentary scrutiny of a direct sale, and the Comte gets the power. Jeremiah Stone listened, his expression unchanged, yet the meticulous way he handled the documents suggested he was deeply invested in her argument. He was a creature of logic, and Cordelia was presenting a logical, if highly damning, case of political corruption. "This is circumstantial, Countess," Stone said, his voice measured. "The Comte is ambitious, yes, but to accuse him of being a party to treason against the crown, against a king who is secretly rewarding him, is a leap. He would be risking his own neck if the plot failed. But the Comte is not risking his neck for a foreign power, advisor. He is risking it for a massive personal gain, with the king's secret blessing." Cordelia countered, her voice rising with sincere desperation. "The true treason is not against the realm. It is the king's treason against the law of the realm. He uses a lie to steal property he cannot legally acquire." She leaned forward, meeting his gaze with a compelling, unyielding sincerity. "You are a man of justice, advisor Stone. Look at the balance of probabilities. Is it more likely that I, a young woman whose entire standing is tied to the stability of the kingdom, suddenly decided to give away my family's ancient land to an enemy? Or is it more likely that the Comte, a man known for his rapacious greed and financial desperation, orchestrated a forgery on behalf of a king who secretly promised him the profit?" Cordelia knew she had to convince him of the sheer emotional truth of her predicament, not just the financial evidence. "The king's motive is the land. My motive is survival. The Count's motive is debt and greed. Follow the money advisor, not the fake letter. The letter is a distraction created by a professional. Stone steepled his fingers, staring not at the documents, but at Cordelia. He was scrutinizing her, weighing her character against the immense power of the man she was accusing. He was a professional skeptic, but he was also a man who valued order. The king's plot was messy, rushed, and potentially destabilizing. Cordelia's counter-narrative, while shocking, was politically neat. "You speak of a professional forger," Stone finally conceded, his voice low and quiet. "A man who specialized in seals and script. Your maid, Rosemary, mentioned a strange, chemical odor near the lower East Wing apartments. Do you have any further information on that thread?" Cordelia hesitated, remembering the risks. She was about to provide Stone with a highly vulnerable piece of information, one that could lead directly to Rosemary if mishandled. But she had no choice. She had to commit fully. "We have reason to believe the forger is a man known as Master Eldrin, a former court scribe now living secretly in apartment 14A of the old East Wing," Cordelia revealed, her voice barely a whisper. "He is reclusive, paid only in gold through the king's steward, and the entire section of the corridor smells of the acid and metal dust used for etching and seal casting." Stone's eyes widened slightly, the first real, emotional reaction Cordelia had witnessed. This was a lead. A physical lead that moved the conspiracy from the realm of high finance into the dark corridors of the palace. "Eldrin," Stone repeated, making a swift, covert note. "A ghost name in the records. He would be the most difficult to trace, and the most dangerous to confront." He looked up, his gaze intense. "If Eldrin is the forger, he is the key. He would possess the tool used to forge your seal, the original die. Finding that die would invalidate the king's entire case, as it would be irrefutable proof of fabrication." "But the Count is the brain, advisor," Cordelia urged. "Eldrin is just the hand. If you move on Eldrin now, the Count will learn of the inquiry, and he will either silence the scribe or destroy the die before you reach it. The Count de Valois must be investigated simultaneously, his movements tracked, his contacts reviewed. We need to catch them both." Stone sat back, his skepticism warring with the clear logic of her discovery. He had been sent to confirm the king's charge or find a politically clean reason for a pardon. He had not been sent to uncover a massive conspiracy involving the king's secret ally. Yet, the confluence of the inexplicable gold payment to the Count and the specific location and profession of the mysterious Eldrin was too precise to be dismissed as mere desperation. "The Queen gave me a mandate to investigate, Countess, not to overturn the structure of the court," Stone cautioned. "But your theory, it explains too much. It explains the rush for your execution. It explains the Count's mysterious wealth. It explains why the king's own courier was behaving like a frightened thief." He closed the folio with a decisive snap. "I will pursue this, Countess, but I will do so with extreme caution. To move on the Count de Valois is to move on the king himself. I must act with total discretion, through channels the king does not yet control. This means I cannot move on Eldrin immediately, or I risk losing the evidence, as you correctly noted. I will first use the few remaining hours before my next meeting with the Queen to verify the Count's financial movements outside of the court's official ledger. I must find a secondary source of proof linking the Count to Eldrin." He rose, a man suddenly burdened by a secret of immense political weight. "You have given me a target, Countess Hayes. Now you must remain here, contained, and above all silent. If word of this investigation leaks from these rooms, the king will not hesitate to strike you down immediately, regardless of the Queen's decree. Your freedom is contingent on my ability to move unseen. We have 4 days remaining." With a final, grave nod, Stone departed, leaving Cordelia staring at the closed door. She was alone again, but no longer helpless. She had taken the immense terror of the accusation and reshaped it into a cold, hard piece of evidence that had penetrated the advisor's professional armor. She had convinced the skeptic. Now, she had to endure the agonizing weight, knowing that the king's ruthless determination was pitted against the methodical caution of Jeremiah Stone, and her life lay balanced precariously between their power struggle. The 7 days were shrinking, and the shadow of the axe felt closer with every passing hour of Stone's silence. The days following Jeremiah Stone's visit folded into a grinding cycle of tense waiting and covert activity. Cordelia and Rosemary were sealed in their apartment, the outside world reduced to the muffled sounds of the palace and the heavy, monotonous pacing of the king's guards outside the door. Stone's silence was the most terrifying element. It meant he was either meticulously chasing the financial thread she had provided, the Comte de Valois, or he had been intercepted, his investigation crushed by the king's overwhelming power. Cordelia was consumed by the realization that if Stone failed, her own direct, physical evidence was the only recourse. She had to find the link between the forger, Eldrin, and the financier, the Comte. She spent hours coaching Rosemary, transforming the maid from an anxious observer into a cautious operative, relying on the servant's unique, privileged access to the palace's hidden underbelly. The messenger, Master Thorne, he would not have been paid in the palace itself, Cordelia instructed, her voice a dry rasp from whispering. Too visible, too traceable. He would have gone to the forger, Eldrin, to deliver a final payment or to collect the finished article. Eldrin's rooms are too small for a clandestine meeting with the Comte. Therefore, the Comte and Eldrin must communicate through a third party, a middleman, or a drop point. Rosemary, armed with this deductive reasoning, began a careful, multi-stage infiltration of the servant network. Under the guise of desperately searching for a lost family heirloom, a silver thimble, she spoke to the kitchen staff, the laundry women, and the young pages. She used the established currency of the servants' hall, gossip and shared grievances, to gather fragments of information. The key came from a page boy, a nervous child named Finn, who served the East Wing. Rosemary learned that a week before the king's accusation, Finn had been given a hefty tip by a man matching Master Thorne's description to deliver a basket of wine and fine meats to the Comte de Valois' town residence. This was strange, as the Comte usually relied on his own servants for such deliveries. More critically, Rosemary learned that the Comte de Valois himself had been making frequent, short, and highly secretive trips to a dilapidated, unused coaching house on the edge of the king's sprawling urban park, a property only legally accessible by way of a narrow, forgotten maintenance road that ran directly behind the East Wing apartments. The coaching house, Cordelia breathed, connecting the disparate facts on her mental map. It's a perfect meeting point. It's off the books, easy to access from Eldrin's rooms via the rear path, and the Comte could arrive there in a simple carriage, unobserved by courtly eyes. The king's messenger, Thorne, or even the Comte himself, could meet Eldrin there to exchange the final forged document for the gold. The picture was now complete. The Comte, the brain, the financier, hired Eldrin, the tool, the forger, through Thorne, the courier, the middleman. The drop point was the abandoned coaching house. But their intellectual victory was immediately overshadowed by a terrifying escalation of the king's ruthlessness. That afternoon, under the pretext of securing royal property, 2 burly, unfamiliar guards, not the usual lazy palace men, stormed into Cordelia's apartment. They were not subtle. They were hunters. His Majesty requires a full inventory of all portable valuables in the Countess Hayes's possession. The leader growled, his eyes sweeping the room with a menacing intensity that was not about jewels. Cordelia stood her ground, her spine rigid with cold defiance. You may inventory the furniture, but my personal effects are private. My jewelry and my private letters are not subject to seizure until a formal judgment is rendered and executed. The guards ignored her. They began to rip through the room, overturning cushions, pulling open drawers, and carelessly scattering the court documents Stone had left behind. They were not looking for silver. They were looking for anything that might confirm Cordelia's suspicions or link her to an active investigation. Stone's notes, hidden ledgers, or a coded message. In the midst of the chaos, the lead guard grabbed Rosemary, seizing her by the arm. "You, maid, you have been overly curious in the kitchens. We have reports of you questioning the staff about the East Wing. What have you seen? Who have you spoken to?" Rosemary froze, her face draining of color, fear paralyzing her. She knew a single misstep would cost both their lives. Cordelia moved instantly, abandoning her noble dignity for sheer, animal survival. She swept a heavy, ornate ceramic vase off a side table, sending it crashing to the floor with a deafening noise that reverberated through the quiet wing. "Get your hands off my maid, you brute!" Cordelia yelled, forcing her voice into a high, hysterical pitch. "She is a simple girl, terrified by your king's injustice. You are thieves and bullies. Get out of my rooms, or I will scream loud enough to bring the queen herself." The unexpected outburst, the sheer noise and disruption, startled the guards. They were accustomed to silent, compliant fear, not furious, high-pitched hysterics. They were here to perform a discreet, intimidating search, not to cause a public scene that would draw the attention of the palace's higher-ranking servants. The lead guard released Rosemary, his face contorted in frustrated rage. "We will return, Countess, and next time we will not be so gentle." They left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving the room in disarray, a clear message of intimidation delivered. Cordelia rushed to Rosemary, pulling her close. "Are you hurt?" "No, my lady, just terrified." Rosemary was shaking violently. They know I was asking. The king is watching us, not just confining us." They were looking for the connection to the East Wing. They were looking for Eldrin's name. The narrow escape confirmed their gravest suspicion. The king was not passively waiting for the reprieve to end. He was actively destroying evidence and silencing witnesses. They had successfully pierced the veil of the conspiracy, and the king's hand was now stretched out, attempting to choke the fragile life out of their counter-investigation. Cordelia helped Rosemary sift through the mess. The guards hadn't found anything, but the close call forced Cordelia to realize she could no longer rely on simple discretion. She had to get the information to Stone immediately, before the king reached Eldrin or the Comte and forced them to destroy the physical evidence, the forging die. "Rosemary, we can no longer wait for Stone's scheduled return," Cordelia announced, her voice steely. "The king's men are looking for the names Eldrin and Valois. If the king is willing to send men to intimidate us, he is willing to send men to kill Eldrin or seize the coaching house. We must break our confinement and deliver this information directly to Jeremiah Stone, or find a secure way to relay it to the queen." But how? The guards outside were now on high alert, suspicious and aggressive. Any attempt to send a message via a servant would be immediately intercepted and traced back to Rosemary. Cordelia paced the room, her thoughts racing. The key was a communication line that bypassed both the king's guards and the general palace staff. It had to be a trusted courier, someone who owed allegiance directly and solely to the queen or to Jeremiah Stone. Then she remembered a subtle detail from her study of the court. Jeremiah Stone had a personal attendant, the silent man who always accompanied him but never spoke, a man whose loyalty was unquestioned and whose movements were rarely scrutinized by the king's men, who focused their surveillance on the main courtiers. Rosemary, the advisor's attendant, the man who was with him when he interviewed me. He is the key. He is Stone's shadow, and he is invisible to the king's paranoia because he is so low-ranking, so quiet. The immediate challenge: how to get a written message to Stone's shadow when the guard stood sentinel 10 feet from the door. Cordelia grabbed a small silver locket she wore, the one heirloom the guards hadn't noticed, containing a miniature of her mother. She pressed a small, tightly folded piece of parchment into the locket and fastened it shut. The parchment contained everything: the name Eldrin and his apartment number, the Comte de Valois as the financier, and the abandoned coaching house as the drop point. "You must find a way to get this locket to the Queen's private suite," Cordelia instructed, her voice urgent but calm. "Not to the Queen herself, that is impossible, but to her waiting maid, the one who is loyal to Stone. If you can slip into the hallway, even for a moment, and pass the locket to someone else who can get it to the Queen's wing." Rosemary shook her head. "Too risky, my lady. The guards will see any handoff. But there is one person. The laundress. Old Agnes. She has served the Queen's wing for 50 years. She is utterly trustworthy, she is deaf, and she hates the King's recent appointments. She considers them uncouth. She passes this way every morning at dawn to collect the Queen's linens, and she pays attention to no one." The plan was desperate, reckless, but rooted in the intimate knowledge of the palace's hidden infrastructure. The next morning, before dawn broke and while the King's guards were heavy with sleep and complacency, Rosemary prepared the ruse. She wrapped a set of Cordelia's fine, embroidered handkerchiefs in a linen bundle, a common request for special washing. As the old laundress, Agnes, shuffled past the doorway, Rosemary feigned a dizzy spell, stumbling out of the room. The King's guard, startled, rushed forward, shouting a warning. In the brief, chaotic moment of the stumble, Rosemary managed to discreetly drop the silver locket into the corner of Agnes's open linen sack, burying it beneath a pile of Queen Genevieve's silks. The guard hauled Rosemary back into the room, threatening her with punishment, but the task was done. The locket, containing the life-saving intelligence, was now in the hands of the Queen's oldest, most trusted servant, and was headed directly into the heart of the Queen's trusted circle. The web of lies had been countered, not by force, but by a desperate, quiet act of espionage. Cordelia now had to pray that Agnes's silent, loyal journey across the palace would be faster than the King's men who were already hunting for Master Eldrin. The countdown had paused, but the stakes had never been higher. If the locket was discovered before it reached its destination, it would be treated as definitive proof of Cordelia's continued treasonous plotting, and the King's hand would fall without mercy. The small, silver locket was Cordelia's Hail Mary, an invisible handoff made in the tense, gray hours before dawn, a moment of reckless desperation framed by a convincing lie of hysterical weakness. Now, the weight of the past 3 days, the close brush with the King's brutal guards, the terror of exposure, the intellectual strain of connecting the Comte to the forger, coalesced into a grinding agony of waiting. Cordelia knew the locket was her only chance. If it failed to reach the Queen's trusted attendant, or if its contents were discovered by one of the King's spies, the message would not bring salvation, but a swift execution. The laundress, Agnes, was a creature of meticulous routine, and it was this very adherence to habit that made her the most secure intermediary. Agnes would proceed through the palace's back staircases, depositing her bundles with the Queen's chief dresser, a woman known for her close, familial relationship with Jeremiah Stone. The message's security lay in its apparent innocence. A locket tucked into the Queen's laundry, an object of sentimental value rather than high treason. By the time the afternoon sun filtered weakly through the bolted windows, Cordelia could scarcely breathe from the tension. She paced the room's worn carpet, every nerve ending screaming with the urgency of time lost. If Stone had been investigating the Comte in the last 48 hours, he would have found the money trail. The locket was meant to give him the physical locations, the forger's den and the meeting point. And then, the quiet, subtle shift occurred. The guard outside, a heavy-set man named Gareth, was abruptly and silently replaced. The new sentinel was a tall, lean man whose face Cordelia had never seen, a man who radiated cold, professional competence. More significantly, he did not look at Cordelia with the expected mix of pity and contempt. He looked at her with a blank, unreadable deference. He was not a king's man, Cordelia intuitively sensed. He was a Queen's man. The message had landed. The Queen, now fully alerted to the sheer depth of her husband's corruption and the scale of the plot involving the Comte de Valois, was moving. Cordelia felt a surge of exhilarating terror. The Queen had acknowledged the coded message, and her response was not a direct visit, which would be too risky, but a subtle change in the structure of Cordelia's immediate prison. A single, quiet chess move. The true significance of this shift became clear moments later when Jeremiah Stone returned. He did not come with the air of a skeptical advisor. He came with the contained intensity of a man carrying the weight of a kingdom's secrets. He dismissed the guard with a curt nod that was instantly obeyed, a subtle display of authority that confirmed Cordelia's deduction. The guard was his or the Queen's. Stone closed the door, his eyes immediately seeking Cordelia's. There was no longer any room for professional skepticism. His expression was grim, confirming that he had seen the evidence. He reached into his coat and produced the silver locket. "This was found among Her Majesty's linens, Countess," Stone stated, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "An unwise maneuver, but effective. Your information is precise. The Comte de Valois is our target. My own investigation into the Comte's recent transactions uncovered a staggering amount of illicit gold movement. Money that bypassed all official ledgers. Money that could only be accounted for by a secret deal of massive proportions. Your financial deduction was correct." Cordelia felt a dizzying moment of relief, quickly followed by the need to press the investigation forward. "And Eldrin? The forger? The coaching house?" I moved immediately. Using the pretext of a minor plumbing inspection, I sent a team into the East Wing apartments. Eldrin is gone. Vanished. The apartment was scrubbed clean, but the faint scent of nitric acid and metal filings was undeniable. The King's spies reached him, or the Comte silenced him before I could. Stone's jaw was tight with professional frustration. He destroyed the immediate physical evidence of the forging process. "But not the final evidence," Cordelia insisted. "If the Comte paid Eldrin for the service, the final exchange was made at the abandoned coaching house. Eldrin would have exchanged the forged letter and perhaps the original die, the most valuable and dangerous piece of equipment, for the final payment in gold. That die, if found, is irrefutable proof of fabrication. It is the only thing that invalidates the King's entire case." Stone nodded, already ahead of her. "That is where the Queen has acted. The King is planning a hunt in the urban park tomorrow, a public display of his leisure. The Queen, under the guise of preparing the terrain, has dispatched a small, reliable unit, men loyal only to her, to the abandoned coaching house. They are searching for the die, any remaining documents, or any sign of the exchange." The Queen's hand had moved with lethal speed and precision, acting directly to secure the only piece of evidence that could save Cordelia and, critically, protect the Queen's political position. "You understand, Countess, that if my men fail to find this die, or if the King's men are merely using the hunt as a cover to remove the last pieces of evidence, you are finished," Stone cautioned. "The Queen's move is a massive political risk. If this counterplot fails, Her Majesty will have no choice but to endorse your execution to maintain the illusion of unity with the King." "I understand the risk," Cordelia affirmed, her voice steady. "But the Queen has shown she values the truth more than the King's lie, because the lie creates instability. I have given Her Majesty the evidence of the King's corruption, not merely my innocence. She will protect her crown by protecting the truth." Stone looked at her, a flicker of admiration crossing his reserved features. "You navigate these waters with surprising speed, Countess. Good. Now we must focus on the Comte. The Queen is laying a public trap for him during the hunt tomorrow. She needs to expose his complicity in a way that is visible to the entire court, while simultaneously securing the physical evidence." He leaned closer, lowering his voice until Cordelia had to strain to hear. "The King is using the pretext of the hunt to finalize the paperwork with the Comte, ensuring the land transfer occurs immediately after your execution. The Comte will be present. The Queen needs an unassailable witness to the Comte's complicity." "I will be the witness," Cordelia stated, instantly grasping the necessary theatricality of the confrontation. "No," Stone countered firmly. "You must remain here. But the Queen needs to know if the Count is wearing something specific, perhaps a new ring or a distinctive piece of jewelry that Eldrin, the forger, may have also created for him as a thank you. Something that only a true conspirator would possess." Cordelia thought back to the few times she had observed the Comte de Valois at court. He was flashy, excessively adorned. He favors a signet ring, a massive piece of gold, shaped like a rampant lion. It is ostentatious, but it is old, his family crest. But a secondary piece. Cordelia searched her memory. Yes, cufflink. He wore a matching set, gold, shaped like an intertwining snake, just last month. He was very proud of them, always drawing attention to them. "The snake cufflinks," Stone murmured, making a note. "A subtle piece of vanity. Eldrin may have fashioned them as a side project. If the Count is wearing them tomorrow, it is a further link to the forger. I will pass this to the Queen." The conversation was over. Stone had the necessary details for the Queen's final move. He stood, his expression hardening back into professional reserve. "Remain contained, Countess. Do not attempt to communicate with Rosemary or anyone else. Your safety is now paramount. The King is looking for an excuse to end this before the 7th day. Do not give him one. The Queen is moving her pieces into position, but the final confrontation will be tomorrow, during the King's hunt. We must secure the die and corner the Count." Stone departed, leaving the new guard outside the door. Cordelia Hayes, alone, walked to the bolted window. The political game had moved from a desperate defense to a massive, calculated counterattack. She was the bait, the focal point of the King's avarice, and now the Queen's desperate play for political stability. Tomorrow, during the King's recreational hunt, the fate of the Ravenshaw lands and Cordelia's life would be decided. She was filled not with despair, but with a fierce, quiet certainty. She had played the game perfectly, using her own entrapment to expose the King's true collaborator. All that remained was the final, devastating reveal. She had passed the burden of proof to the Queen's capable hand. She only had to survive the next 24 hours. Jeremiah Stone moved through the palace's hushed corridors like a shadow cast by the Queen's own authority. He had the precision of a clockmaker and the access of a top-tier bureaucrat, a lethal combination in a court where discretion was power. Cordelia's information, the financial link to the Comte de Valois and the specific physical detail of the forger Eldrin in the East Wing, had shattered his professional reserve. The King's plot was no longer a theoretical risk to the Crown's stability. It was a visible, verifiable crime, orchestrated by one of the King's most ambitious allies. Stone's immediate priority, following his departure from Cordelia's confinement, was not to chase the missing Eldrin, but to secure the intellectual evidence. He needed to prove Eldrin's connection to the court and, more critically, to the Comte de Valois, before making a physical move that would alert the King. He knew the Comte was being tracked, but the King's agents were highly skilled at destroying paper trails. Stone retreated to his private office, a small, climate-controlled space within the deep recesses of the Royal Archives, a privilege granted to his position as royal advisor. This room was his sanctuary, shielded by heavy stone walls and coated bureaucratic locks, a place where the King's influence rarely penetrated. The air here smelled of aged paper, leather, and the cool, sterile scent of history. He plunged immediately into the employment registers of the past decade. Cordelia had named the forger Eldrin. Stone searched for the name, running it through the rolls of court scribes, copyists, and royal sealmakers. Eldrin was not listed on the current roster. He was a ghost, a clear indication he was operating outside legal bounds. Stone then accessed the archived disciplinary records, the repository of bureaucratic failures and moral lapses, the kind of instability the Crown preferred to forget. He spent hours tracing names, cross-referencing known forgers and those dismissed for financial malfeasance. Finally, late into the night, he found a match. Not Eldrin, but a man named Erasmus Delaney. Erasmus Delaney had been a gifted, yet unstable, court scribe some years prior, dismissed and quietly disgraced for accepting bribes to forge minor documents for lesser nobles. Delaney was known for his mastery of archaic scripts and, crucially, for his specific skill in the delicate, meticulous art of creating counterfeit wax seals. His work was undetectable by all but the most experienced eyes. The records indicated that Delaney had vanished from court after his dismissal, sinking into the capital's underbelly, changing his name to avoid prosecution. His last known address was listed, with cold bureaucratic efficiency, as a low-rent tenement near the docks, but the address had been scribbled out and replaced with a handwritten note in the margin. Steward's transfer to East Wing, apartment 14A, paid for in gold. Stone felt a chill run down his spine. Eldrin was Erasmus Delaney. Cordelia's master Eldrin was the exact man capable of producing the perfect, forged document and the corresponding seal. The handwritten note detailing the payment in gold and the specific apartment number was a categorical link. The king's steward, the man who would have been handling the Comte de Valois' illicit cash payment, had moved the professional forger into the palace itself. This was not merely financial corruption. It was an active conspiracy to commit murder under the color of law, organized from within the heart of the crown's administration. The evidence was now irrefutable. The unstable former scribe, Delaney Eldrin, was being paid by a powerful, shadowy court figure, the Comte de Valois, who was being secretly funded by the king, Alastair Penn. The urgency was now overwhelming. Stone understood that his brief investigation was a race not against Cordelia's deadline, but against the king's desperate need for cleanup. If the king's men hadn't found Eldrin, the Comte's men certainly would. The last, crucial piece of evidence, the forging die itself, had to be secured. Stone immediately initiated the Queen's countermove, the one he had discussed with Cordelia. He dispatched a coded, highly compartmentalized order using a system only he and the Queen trusted. The message bypassed the King's official messenger network entirely, reaching a small, hand-picked unit of the Royal Guard, men whose oaths of loyalty were to the Queen's stability, not the King's personal ambition. The orders were precise. Immediately and covertly secure the perimeter of the abandoned coaching house adjacent to the urban park. Search for any evidence of recent transactions, particularly metal instruments, sealing wax, or discarded papers. Treat the area as a highly sensitive crime scene. Clearance is granted under the guise of preparing the King's hunting trail. As the sun began to rise on the fourth day, marking the final 72 hours of Cordelia's reprieve, Stone was exhausted but grimly satisfied. He had confirmed the identities of all players in the conspiracy. The king's motive, greed, the financier, the Comte de Valois, and the professional hand, Erasmus Delaney/Eldrin. The key physical evidence, the forging die, was now the subject of a covert, armed search by the Queen's own men. Stone now had to focus on the political maneuvering. He could not present mere archival evidence to the court. He needed the die. And he needed to create a public scenario where the Comte de Valois would inadvertently expose his own complicity, making the king's subsequent retreat unavoidable. He knew the king was organizing a public hunt for that very day, a thinly veiled excuse to meet the Comte and finalize the land transfer documents ahead of the expected execution. It was the king's arrogance, his belief that Cordelia was utterly powerless, that was his own undoing. Stone met with the Queen privately, hours before the court was scheduled to reconvene. The meeting was brief, held in the Queen's small, unadorned solar, away from the court's eavesdroppers. He laid out the evidence. The archived record of Delaney, the gold payment trail, and the Comte's obvious motive. "Your Majesty," Stone stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "The king is using his position to commit political murder and theft. Cordelia Hayes is innocent. The only remaining question is how to use this truth to expose the Comte without inviting a direct conflict with the king that would splinter the court." Queen Genevieve, cool and controlled, merely nodded, her eyes sharp. The king has overreached, advisor. He has threatened the stability of the crown, and that I will not allow. The hunt is today. The Count will be present, expecting his reward. We will use the hunt to lay a public trap. She issued a series of quiet, devastating orders. Jeremiah Stone was to position himself near the Count during the hunt. Cordelia's description of the Count's unique, expensive snake cufflinks, the possible gift from his forger Eldrin, was the thread to be pulled. The queen would appear at the height of the hunt, interrupting the king's proceedings under the pretense of a trivial matter, while Stone, acting on a prearranged signal, would execute the public confrontation. Stone left the queen's solar, the weight of the conspiracy heavy on his shoulders. He was no longer just the advisor. He was the queen's agent in a silent, deadly coup against the king's personal ambition. His next task: attend the king's hunt, stand beside the guilty man, and wait for the subtle, terrible signal from the queen that would begin the final public showdown. The missing piece of the puzzle, Eldrin's identity, was now in place, and the final moves on the chessboard were about to commence. Cordelia's life, and the political future of the realm, depended on the success of the queen's covert team and Stone's own nerve in the face of the king's wrath. The morning of the king's hunt dawned cold and shrouded in a thin, deceptive mist that hugged the grounds of the urban park. It was a perfect setting for the king's display of effortless power, and an equally perfect concealment for the queen's countermove. For Cordelia Hayes, locked in her apartment, the silence of the morning was a screaming void, filled with the terrifying ifs of the queen's plan. She was completely isolated, relying on her faith in Jeremiah Stone's competence and the invisible actions of the queen's hidden agents. Cordelia was consumed by the lack of physical proof. Eldrin, the forger, had vanished. The forged letter was damning. The only remaining path to exoneration was the acquisition of the forging die, or a public, undeniable confession from the Comte de Valois himself. Hours later, the muffled sounds of horses, hounds, and the distant, boisterous laughter of courtiers signaled the start of the hunt. Cordelia stood by the bolted window, picturing the scene in the park. The king, resplendent and severe, surrounded by his sycophants, and the Comte de Valois, sleek and greedy, waiting for his reward. Meanwhile, Jeremiah Stone was exactly where the queen required him to be. Standing near the Comte de Valois, amidst the glittering crowd gathered before the king's hunting pavilion. The Comte, oblivious to the net tightening around him, was in high spirits, his large gold signet ring flashing as he gestured broadly, discussing the inevitable political demise of the Countess Hayes. He wore the precise, ostentatious pair of gold cufflinks Cordelia had described, the intertwining snake design, likely commissioned from his forger Eldrin, as a mark of their successful conspiracy. Stone played the part of the deferential advisor, his attention seemingly fixed on the king's preparations. But his true focus was on the subtle choreography of the queen's plan. His hand, resting lightly on his coat, was near the queen's personal messenger, who was waiting for the signal to deliver an urgent, coded message. The tension was broken by a flurry of activity near the queen's carriage. A cloaked figure, one of Stone's men, hurried through the ranks of courtiers. He was carrying a small, heavy parcel wrapped tightly in dark canvas. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man on a critical mission, his eyes fixed only on Stone. The queen's team had been successful. The parcel was slipped into Stone's hands under the guise of an urgent, sealed dispatch from the exchequer. Stone's heart hammered a rhythm against his ribs. He knew what was in the canvas. The missing piece, the ultimate proof. The queen's men had found the abandoned coaching house and, more importantly, they had found the forging die hidden beneath the floorboards, wrapped in a linen cloth stained with chemical residue. Stone did not open the parcel. To do so would be to break the public illusion of his professional impartiality. He tucked the parcel securely into his private satchel, the cool, heavy weight of the metal die a potent reassurance against the king's wrath. The moment had arrived. Queen Genevieve, riding up on a beautifully appointed mare, interrupted the king's final address to the hunting party. Her action was subtle, delivered with an air of trivial complaint about the excessive noise, but her timing was absolute. The king, irritated by the interruption, paused, his attention drawn toward his wife. This was Stone's signal. Stone stepped forward, addressing the Comte de Valois directly, his voice cutting clearly through the sudden quiet left by the Queen's intervention. Comte de Valois, a word, if you please. The Exchequer has a minor concern regarding the gold payment for the Montclair lands 6 months ago. A simple matter of receipt, nothing more. The Comte, startled by the direct approach, smiled with forced charm. My dear advisor Stone, a minor matter, surely. That payment was executed flawlessly. The gold was delivered, and the king's steward received it. Indeed, Stone said, his eyes fixed on the Comte's smug face. But the source of the gold remains perplexing. Our records indicate that a significant portion was transferred through a low-ranking scribe, a man known as Erasmus Delaney. The effect of the name was immediate and catastrophic. The Comte's smooth, charming facade shattered. His face, seconds ago florid with self-satisfaction, drained instantly of all color, leaving his skin sickly pale. His composure broke. His hand, which had been resting casually on his hip, flew up to instinctively touch the gold cufflinks on his wrist. The snake design, the damning link to the forger. Delaney? The Comte sputtered, his voice cracking with terror. I have no knowledge of any such scribe. I transact only with the royal accounts. On the contrary, Comte, Stone pressed, moving in for the kill. He opened his satchel and withdrew not the die, but the folio containing the archived record of Delaney's disciplinary dismissal and the handwritten note confirming his relocation to the East Wing, paid for in gold. Erasmus Delaney, known by the alias Eldrin, was a disgraced court scribe known for his expertise in forgery. Your payment, Comte, was used to move him into the palace itself. He vanished 48 hours ago, just as my investigation into the forged treason document began to close in. And he vanished just after this was found. Stone paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink into the hushed crowd. He then produced the canvas parcel. The king, sensing his carefully constructed plot unraveling, began to move forward, his face contorted in a mask of fury. Advisor Stone, you overstep your authority. That man is a friend of the crown. Cease this immediate slander. The king roared, attempting to reclaim control. Your Majesty, I must insist. The integrity of the crown requires proof, not accusation, Stone stated, bowing only fractionally. He unwrapped the canvas, revealing the cold, heavy object within. A metal die, precisely carved with the intricate details of the Hayes family crest, marred only by the specific, familiar hairline fracture Cordelia had noticed on the forged letter. This, Your Majesty, was found in the abandoned coaching house, the agreed-upon location for the final exchange between the Comte's man, the courier Thorne, and the forger Eldrin, Stone declared, holding the die aloft for the surrounding courtiers to see. This is the tool used to forge the Countess Hayes's death warrant. This is the forging die. This piece of evidence proves, beyond any doubt, that the letter of high treason was a meticulous fabrication, paid for by the Comte de Valois for his immense personal gain, and designed to strip the Countess of her ancestral lands. The silence that followed was immense, a collective gasp swallowed by the vast, open sky of the park. The king was momentarily paralyzed, his rage choked by the undeniable physical evidence. The Comte de Valois, utterly exposed and knowing the full weight of the Queen's political machinery was now upon him, did the only thing a true scoundrel could. He broke. No. It was the king's idea. He promised me the land. He needed the gold. He said she was weak. It was his plan. He knew I would pay Delaney. He gave me the funds initially. The Comte shrieked, his voice ragged with self-preservation, pointing a trembling finger at King Alastair. The confession was unplanned, theatrical, and devastating. The king's face flushed a deep, terrifying crimson. The public nature of the accusation, the sight of the forging die, and the Comte's terrified breakdown made the truth immediately, sickeningly clear to every noble and courtier present. The king was not only a tyrant, but a petty thief who would orchestrate murder for land and money. Queen Genevieve, seizing the opportunity, rode forward, her horse stopping directly between the disgraced Comte and her enraged husband. Her composure was absolute, her voice ringing with the final authority of the law. "Enough!" the queen commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. The Comte de Valois, by his own panicked confession and the physical evidence presented by Advisor Stone, is immediately stripped of all titles and property and placed under arrest for high treason against the crown and the laws of the realm. She did not look at the king, but her words were directed at his authority. This entire affair was a conspiracy of greed and ambition, rooted in corruption that sought to pervert the course of justice. Countess Cordelia Hayes has been falsely accused. She is exonerated, immediately and fully. The political crisis was over. The Queen had checked the king's ambition, exposed his collaborator, and restored the integrity of the law. The Comte was dragged away, still babbling his panicked accusations against the king. The king, defeated and exposed, stood rigid, his authority shattered in the eyes of his court. The final confrontation had been won, not with swords, but with a piece of metal and a terrified confession. Jeremiah Stone approached the queen, bowing deeply, the forging die still resting heavily in his hands. The only thing missing was the countess herself, still confined, unaware that the scoundrel had been revealed and her life secured. The queen, her eyes hard with political triumph, simply nodded. The time had come for Cordelia Hayes to be released and to take her rightful place in the court, not as a victim, but as a formidable political survivor. The final act was the Countess's own vindication. The Grand Council chamber had never been more silent, not even during the initial, terrifying accusation. The 7-day reprieve was over, and the political atmosphere was so thick with tension it felt corrosive. The court was packed, the nobles filling the benches, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. They knew a bloodletting was imminent, but they were unsure whose. The news of the Comte de Valois' public breakdown at the hunt, his desperate confession of the king's involvement in the plot, had traveled through the palace like wildfire, tearing the veil of the crown's legitimacy. King Alastair Penn sat rigidly on the throne, his massive frame radiating a dangerous, cold fury. The humiliation of the previous day had been profound, but he was a tyrant. He would not concede. He planned to use the legal framework to force Cordelia's death, clinging to the original forged evidence. He wore his deepest crimson robes, symbolizing absolute, unforgiving power. Queen Genevieve Shaw sat beside him, her expression a cool, perfect mask of measured neutrality. She was the one holding the true power now, but she had to use it with absolute precision to avoid plunging the court into civil chaos. Countess Cordelia Hayes was brought in by the Queen's own, unadorned guard, the one who had replaced the king's aggressive sentinel. She walked with a composed dignity, dressed in a simple, high-necked black gown that seemed to absorb the light, drawing all attention to the youth and sincerity of her face. She was seated once more on the low stool, but this time, her terror had been replaced by a focused, searing conviction. She looked not at the king, but straight ahead, a picture of defiant innocence. Jeremiah Stone stood near the dais, his presence a quiet, unwavering challenge to the king's authority. He was dressed in his somber advisor attire, and in his hands he held the evidence, the forged letter, the financial ledgers, and the object that had saved Cordelia's life, the forging die. The king opened the proceedings with the voice of a man determined to bury the truth. The period of reprieve has expired. The investigation, which, while raising unfortunate questions regarding the loyalty of some former courtiers, failed to invalidate the core evidence. The document of treason, sealed with the Hayes family crest, remains uncontested. The king slammed his hand on the armrest, his voice booming across the chamber. The evidence of high treason stands. I demand the forfeiture of the Ravenshaw lands and the immediate execution of the Countess Cordelia Hayes. A ripple of nervous murmurs went through the noble spectators. The king was forcing the issue, refusing to acknowledge the Comte's confession, trying to sweep the entire corruption scandal under the Countess's death. Cordelia rose, not waiting for permission, her eyes locking onto the king's. Her voice, though young, cut through the tension with astonishing clarity. Your Majesty, I object. The document is contaminated. The evidence presented against me is not merely contested. It is a proven fabrication, orchestrated by your disgraced ally, the Comte de Valois, for the sole purpose of financial theft. The king's face was dark with rage. Silence! You dare to accuse the crown. I dare to speak the truth, Your Majesty. A truth that was manufactured for your own financial gain, Cordelia stated, maintaining her eye contact. She then turned her attention to the entire chamber, addressing the assembled nobility. The king accuses me of treason against the realm. I accuse the king of treason against the law. Jeremiah Stone stepped forward, a formidable figure of objective authority. Your Majesty, I must intercede. The Countess has provided irrefutable proof of fabrication. I hold in my hand the physical evidence that invalidates the Crown's original charge. Stone raised the small, canvas-wrapped parcel, slowly unwrapping it until the heavy metal forging die was revealed, glinting dully in the light filtering from the high windows. This, noble lords and ladies, Stone announced, his voice devoid of emotion, yet ringing with absolute authority, was found hidden at the clandestine meeting point used by the Comte de Valois and his hired forger, Erasmus Delaney. This die is a perfect, flawless replica of the Hayes family crest, bearing the exact minute flaw visible on the intercepted treasonous letter. This is the tool of the crime. The existence of this forgery die proves the treasonous letter was not written by the Countess Hayes, but crafted by the Comte de Valois and his scribe to facilitate the theft of her lands. He then brought out the court ledgers. Furthermore, the financial records, now fully audited, clearly demonstrate the Comte de Valois' mysterious payment for the Montclair lands was a direct, illicit transfer to the king's private treasury, bypassing all parliamentary and legal oversight. The motive was not defense of the realm, but pure, simple avarice. The combination of the physical evidence and the financial proof was a devastating blow. The king, cornered and exposed, could only sputter. The Comte lies. He confessed out of cowardice. The die is a setup. This is a conspiracy against the throne. But the damage was done. The nobles saw the forging die. They heard the Comte's public breakdown, and they understood the king's desperate, furious attempt to cling to the lie. The king had undermined the very law he was sworn to uphold. This was the moment Queen Genevieve had waited for. She rose from her throne, her movements slow and commanding, drawing every eye in the room. She was the picture of political stability and measured justice. The king's passion for justice is commendable, but the law must be clear and absolute. The queen announced, her voice resonating with cool, unchallengeable authority. The evidence presented by Advisor Stone is irrefutable. The existence of a specialized forging die, combined with the sworn testimony of the Comte de Valois' spontaneous confession in the presence of the court, invalidates the integrity of the intercepted letter. She looked directly at her furious husband, her eyes challenging his very command. The integrity of the crown must remain paramount. To execute a noble based on evidence now proven false would be to endorse lawlessness and corruption. She then turned to Cordelia, her expression softening only slightly into a look of sober acknowledgement. Countess Cordelia Hayes, the crown has caused you immense injury and peril. The court finds you exonerated. All charges of treason are expunged from your name. Your lands, your titles, and your honor are immediately and irrevocably restored." A wave of audible relief and hushed approval swept through the court. Justice, cold and pragmatic, had been served. The king, defeated, could do nothing but slump back onto his throne, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage. He had been thoroughly, publicly checked by his own wife, using the very legal structure he had tried to corrupt. Cordelia, her entire body shaking with the delayed shock of relief, remained standing. She was free. She had faced down the king's fury and survived. She was no longer just the accused countess. She was the countess who had exposed the king's corruption. Queen Genevieve addressed the court one last time. "The true conspirator, the Comte de Valois, has been apprehended and will face the full penalty for high treason. Let this be a clear message to all who serve the crown. The law is absolute, and corruption will not be tolerated." Stone stepped toward Cordelia, a flicker of genuine, unreserved relief in his eyes. He gently offered her the forging die, wrapped now in a clean linen cloth. "Your concrete proof, Countess. You have not just been acquitted, you have earned your place in this court. Your political acumen saved your life." Cordelia took the heavy die, the cold metal a physical anchor to the terrifying ordeal. She had entered the chamber to face death, and she left holding the weapon that had saved her life. She was escorted out of the chamber, not as a prisoner, but as a silent victor, the gaze of every noble following her with newly awakened respect and profound caution. The final confrontation was over. The Countess Hayes had survived the king's wrath and emerged as a formidable, politically hardened figure in the queen's newly stabilized court. The ultimate resolution was no longer just about survival, but about embracing the power her newly acquired status afforded her. The sudden, blinding sunlight of freedom felt almost as overwhelming as the shadows of her confinement had been. Cordelia Hayes did not walk from the Grand Council chamber. She was propelled by the collective force of the Queen's authority and the court's shock. She was escorted back to her apartment, not as a prisoner awaiting execution, but as a noblewoman whose safety was now a matter of state security. The guards outside her door were gone, replaced by the Queen's own loyal, silent retainers. The physical trappings of her confinement were dissolved, but the psychological remnants, the razor-sharp political caution she had earned, remained. Rosemary rushed to her, tears of pure, overwhelming relief streaming down her face, clutching Cordelia's hands and repeating thanksgivings to the heavens. The fear that had defined their last week was finally lifted, replaced by a profound, trembling triumph. "My lady, I heard the murmurs from the antechamber. They said the Comte confessed. They said the Queen herself ruled. You are free. You are safe." Rosemary wept, unable to contain the emotional eruption. Cordelia, still gripping the wrapped forging die, the cold, heavy heart of the conspiracy, felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, followed by a surge of clarity. She had gambled her life and won, not through sentiment, but through rigorous, relentless logic. "We are safe, Rosemary, because we spoke the truth with evidence the court could not ignore," Cordelia said, her voice husky but firm. "The king is checked, the land is secured, and the truth is written into the public record. We survived." The rest of the day was a blur of necessary political ritual. Jeremiah Stone arrived to convey the Queen's immediate actions. The Ravenshaw lands were formally sequestered under Queen Genevieve's protection, ensuring the king could not attempt a legislative workaround. The Comte's properties were seized, his name struck from all noble registries. The Queen was meticulously reinforcing the law, using Cordelia's innocence as the foundation for her own political ascendancy. "Her Majesty requires your presence tomorrow, Countess," Stone informed her, his expression now openly respectful. "Not in the judgment hall, but in the Queen's private solar. This is not a formal hearing. It is a political conversation between two survivors." The next morning, Cordelia walked through the palace as a changed woman. The court, once so quick to judge and condemn, now parted for her. Nobles who had previously averted their gaze now offered profound, nervous bows, their eyes filled with a new assessment of her power. She was no longer the politically naive young countess. She was a force, a symbol of the Queen's victory over the King's tyranny. She met Queen Genevieve in the Solar, a room of quiet elegance that perfectly reflected the Queen's controlled power. The Queen was alone, seated at a small writing desk, engaged in the monotonous work of governance. She did not rise, but gestured for Cordelia to sit. "Countess Hayes," the Queen began, her voice cool, yet carrying a resonance of genuine regard. "You provided the means to secure not only your own life, but the political balance of this court. The King, in his avarice, threatened the very foundation of my authority. You and Advisor Stone provided the hammer to strike down that threat." Cordelia knew this was not praise, but political recognition. "I only defended my family's legacy, Your Majesty. I am grateful for the chance you gave me." "Grateful is a common court sentiment, Countess. I prefer useful," the Queen countered, a faint, dry smile touching her lips. "The King is enraged, but impotent. He will not forget this. The Comte's confession implicated him deeply, forcing me to act with a clear political mandate. Your lands are secure, but your position is not. You have earned a powerful enemy, and you require powerful protection." The Queen leaned forward, resting her hands on the desk. "You entered this court politically naive. You leave it politically astute. You discovered the forger, you identified the financier, and you deduced the King's motive, all from within a bolted room. Your mind, Countess, is too sharp, and your courage too evident, to be wasted on managing a remote estate." Cordelia waited, recognizing the moment was not about her past, but her future. "I require loyalty, competence, and a clear understanding of the law and its corruption," the Queen continued. "Advisor Stone will remain in his post, but I am creating a new position, the Crown's regulator of lands and titles. You will be charged with auditing all major land transfers that have occurred under the King's recent, questionable decrees, and you will be responsible for ensuring the future integrity of the noble registry. You will report directly to me, bypassing the King's Council entirely." The appointment was audacious, a direct political snub to the King, and a meteoric rise for Cordelia. It placed her at the very center of the court's power, where she would oversee the financial integrity the King had so carelessly undermined. It was a position of immense trust and immense danger. "It would be my profound honor to serve Your Majesty." Cordelia accepted instantly, her voice strong and unwavering. She did not need to ask the salary or the benefits. The reward was the power to protect her own and others like her from the corruption she had just exposed. The Queen nodded, a flicker of genuine approval in her eyes. "Good. Now you will require resources. Advisor Stone will assist you in establishing your office. You have not just secured your legacy, Countess. You have redefined it. You fought the King with your mind and won." Cordelia left the Solar not only exonerated, but transformed. She was no longer just the Countess of Ravenshaw, but an officer of the Queen's own authority. She understood her rise was a political shield for the Queen, but she also understood the power it granted her to enforce the justice the King had ignored. Her first act was to quietly request a significant stipend for Rosemary, securing her maid's future and rewarding the loyal shadow who had risked everything. Her second was to retrieve the forging die from Stone, not to destroy it, but to have it encased in clear resin. It would sit on her new office desk, a cold, constant reminder of the price of political failure and the source of her own resilience. Cordelia Hayes, once a victim destined for the axe, now stood strong and powerful. She had earned her right to her legacy through defiance, wit, and a refusal to be silenced. She had found a clear, unshakable purpose in fighting the tyranny she had survived. The young woman who had wept with fear was gone. In her place stood the Crown's regulator, ready to face the permanent, quiet wrath of King Alastair Penn, a formidable figure who had carved her own destiny from the crucible of treason. The final, sweet victory was not merely survival, but the power to ensure no one else would suffer the same fate. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.